Capitalism is a great system, in particular for poor people. This might be a theory that surprises you, but I'll give you some facts about that. About 200 years ago, when capitalism was created, the 90% of the world population lived in extreme poverty, and that quota has fallen to less than 10%. What a great result that is. But even more noticeable is half of that reduction took place in the last 35 years. And the special thing I want to raise here, in the last 35 years, have been, for example, criticized by Thomas Piketty, a French economist, have been considered to be the worst 35 years of capitalism because they have created great inequalities in that time. Inequalities are the main argument against capitalism. And so depending on how you look at it, it shows how you can look at the world and see different things. I think the number of people suffering from extreme poverty has gone from 1.5 billion and has dropped to a very small number compared, relatively speaking. And I think that's a great achievement for the last 35 years. But the other factors don't affect me or interest me. Reducing poverty is, I think, a great thing. I think I can say capitalism is a system in which businessmen decide what is produced, how much is produced, and ultimately the consumers decide what they buy. In the social system, the state decides what is planned. It plans how the economy works. Obviously, it's not that simple, but nowhere in the world is there a purely capitalistic system, and there is no purely socialist system. North Korea even has private ownership. In the GDR, there was private ownership, and the capitalism is available in many countries, but often highly regulated. In Germany, for example, car companies decided which cars they would produce, and now the state sets fleet targets, which the automobile producers have to comply with. So I'm talking about the test tube theory. We've got a test tube, and there are two articles in that. There is the market and there's the state. And then if you look into that test tube, if you pour more market or more state into that tube, what happens? And so I looked at history, and I've looked at certain countries and looked at what happened. I'll start by looking at an interesting country, China. The book that starts with a sad story. The biggest socialist experiment ever, Mao's Great Leap Forward, end of the 50s, early 60s in China. 45 million people died in that experiment. I talk about this kind of thing worldwide, and I asked people, have you ever asked kids at school, have you ever heard about the Great Leap Forward in China? And did you hear about how many people died there? I might talk about this in Korea or the USA or Great Britain. Most people have never heard about this. They've never heard about that. And then at the end of the Mao period, so we're talking 1980, in China, there 88% of the people were suffering from extreme poverty. Today, that has fallen to less than 1%. That's never, ever happened in the world before. In the whole history of the world, there are now 800 million Chinese people have escaped poverty. So how did that happen? Well, dead simple. Deng Xiaoping was a reformer, and he said, let's let some people get rich. Let's let some people get rich. That happened, and private ownership was introduced, market elements were introduced, and this is my test tube theory. You put more market, more private ownership, and the development will change direction and move in a certain direction. Some people might say, but the role of the state is still very large in China. Is it now a purely capitalist society? Of course it isn't. China has got a mixed system. Other systems are like that too. They've moved from 100%. They've moved away from 100% state, but the state fraction is still very large. And I've talked with Chang Wai in Peking about this, and he kept on repeating one theory. He said that the folk was not because of the state, but in spite of the state. So the success was despite the state, and so this is a theory which has been well proven in many books. And China, if you read that China is successful because the state is regulating everything, that's wrong. It's successful because there are more and more private companies, private operations, more and more market aspects, market elements. Another example I would like to present now is South Korea. I was there last year. I was surprised when I got there. I was in a hotel. I went down a few stairs to buy something and discovered a massive shopping center there, which I've never ever seen the like of in Europe. In South Korea, many people have smartphones, but during the 60s in South Korea, Korea was a very poor land, poverty-stricken company, as poor as even the poorest companies of sub-Saharan Africa, and it went from in the north of the country they went for a planned economy. In the south of the country they went for a capitalist approach, and you can see in North Korea people still suffer great hunger when the harvests fail. In South Korea we can see an exporting country and one of the most successful exporting countries in the world. And there have been yesterday in the Die Welt magazine, I saw a graph showing how many patents are registered throughout the world. Europe looked bad on that particular index. The number of patents in the Asian world is much higher than in Europe, but you don't need to go to Korea to see the experiment between socialism and capitalism. Germany had two states too, and the Trabant never overtook the Mercedes in terms of being the best car. And so when I talk with students, I would ask which percentage of the population in 1989, when the DDR failed, had a telephone. In West Germany, 99.3% of the households had phones. In the GDR, it was less than 20%. And even at that time, almost a third of the people in West Germany had a computer. In the GDR, it was less than 13%. And in 80% of the West Germans had a car, and 45% of East Germans had a car. Do you know how long you had to wait to buy a car? To get a car in the DDR, you had to wait up to 17 years to get a car in the DDR at that time. And in West Germany, you could buy any car you wanted, a VW or Toyota or Mercedes. You could buy any car you wanted. In the GDR, that wasn't quite the case, and that's the big difference between capitalism and socialism. And that's why I'm a little bit worried to see how the car industry is being reduced into a planned organization, and maybe they're not looking at what consumers want to buy. And yeah, we're moving back towards the GDR system. In Germany currently, one saying that apartments cannot aren't a product, and in Berlin there's a rule been introduced in Berlin that rents have been capped, and the last person who did that was a guy called Adolf Hitler. That was his last great gift to the people. of Germany at that time was to cap the rents. In the DDR, there was a cap on rents. The state built lots of flats, but in 1989, why? That which the left in Germany, or people like Kevin Kühnert, are propaganding in Germany at the moment. In the GDR, when GDR collapsed in 1989, most of the flats had had coal-burning stoves. 80% had no bath in the flat. 40% of the houses were damaged. 11% of them were basically uninhabitable. And is that the path we want to take right now? That's what happened when you have state-run accommodation and the cap on rents. And so the socialists obviously say, yeah, we don't want that. We don't want to go back to the DDR. We don't want to go back to Maoism. But they always come up with some new experiment that fascinates them. The last experiment of this kind was Venezuela. Hugo Chavez arrived in power about 30 years ago, and the socialism has finally arrived in the 21st century. Finally, there was a system which they could identify with Venezuelan capitalism. China had left that path. North Korea wasn't a great shining example of what socialism can achieve. Venezuela, that's the place. That's when they got great big eyes. And 20 years later, what did they do? They introduced more state, less market. What happened? Today, people are starving in Venezuela. The inflation rate is the highest in the world. It's almost immeasurable. It might be 1,000,000%. Petrol. It's the country with the most oil in the ground in the world, and they have to import petrol from Iran. And the socialists say, yeah, those are just the sanctions of the US imperialist policies. North Korea would be doing great, and Cuba as well, and Venezuela, they would be doing great if they weren't suffering from these evil sanctions. 10% of the population has already left Venezuela, and they've gone to other countries. And it's interesting to see where they have gone to. I don't think anyone's actually escaped from South Korea to North Korea, or left the DDR, the GDR, or left West Germany to escape into the GDR. I think there are a couple of cases, and that was Angela Merkel's father. He did actually leave West Germany and go to East Germany. So maybe something went wrong then, a long time ago. But it's Chile, the most capitalistic country in South America. They don't leave Chile and go to Venezuela. In fact, they're all going the other direction. They're trying to get away from socialism and move towards capitalism. And the problem is always the same pattern we see. A socialist experiment starts, and everyone there's great enthusiasm. The intellectuals are all for it. And that was even the case during Stalin's period. Leading intellectuals, Sartre, praised Stalin. And Bertolt Brecht, he loved Stalin. And when it failed, then they say, oh, no, that wasn't really the right kind of socialism. But the next time, it'll be great. And, let's just imagine for a second there's some household bakes a cake, and gender guys will say, the man, the husband, the man can bake the cake. That's no problem. And they bake the cake, and the visitors eat the cake, and they're all sick. They're all ill. And something was on the recipe. The next time, I'll change the recipe. I've just got to adjust the recipe, and then I'll get it ready. Obviously, I'll change the recipe. She invites everyone again. Again, the guests all fall ill. And the housewife said, I've got to change the recipe. I'll put a few more ingredients into it. And the third week she invites her guests. The guests, they fall ill again. And he does it 24 times, changes the recipe, and the guests always become sick. You might say that's never ever happened. Hey, that's happened. Exactly, that has happened. Socialism has been here 24 times. It's always a slightly different recipe, different ingredients, but they've tried it in China, they tried it in Cuba, they tried it in Venezuela. Different recipe to the Soviet Union, the different recipe in Yugoslavia or in Romania, but it's never ever worked. And I saw there was a picture on Facebook recently I posted. There was a used poster in her hand, and it said, "A great list of all successful socialist countries." And it was an empty poster. And you might say, okay, that's communism. Nobody wants communism. We want to have a democratic socialism is what we want. And democratic socialism, has it ever existed? Yes, it has existed. In Sweden, for example, in the 70s, everything was realized of which socialists dream. High tax, lots of state intervention. The taxes were so high that even the social democrats were started getting angry about it. For example, Astrid Lindgren, she was upset about. She worked out that her tax rate was 102%. She published an article in a paper there and called it the Tax Fairytale, and she was told, you can't add up, lady. You should just keep writing your books. So she actually calculated, and Olof Palme had to apologize, and the Swedish finally left that crazy path they were on. It's no longer socialist. It is now a capitalist country. Just as much, for example, the USA is. And capitalism, even more capitalist. The income taxes are higher in Sweden, but there's no inheritance tax, there's no asset tax, wealth tax doesn't exist. Lots of people don't know that about it. It hit the buffers 40 years ago, drove the best people out of the country. IKEA, the founder of... He forced the guy out of the country. He left to Denmark, but it wasn't any better there. And then he left there and went to Switzerland and spent the rest of his life as the richest man in Europe. Spent his time in Switzerland. But for the last couple of years, he did move back to Sweden. But rich people can leave if they want to. Great Britain, there was an example like that. Democratic socialism. You may have heard of that Beatles song called Taxman, and the Beatles sing about 95% of the tax they had to pay in the country, and they're actually that wasn't the case. They're actually paying they were paying 98% tax and income tax. The system then hit the buffers. There were strikes. There was massive inflation. There was massive unemployment. In the end, it was called the sick man of Europe. That was Great Britain, and in the IMF.
Großbritannien dann stützen, bis Margaret Thatcher kam. Und was hat die gemacht wieder? Reagenzglas, mehr Markt, privatisiert und auf einmal wurde alles besser. Also auch ein Beispiel von einem Experiment.
And you might say Zitelmann, he's got these experiments. He's only showing the examples which fit in with his theory. There's a chapter in my book called The Index of Economic Freedoms. It's calculated every year by the Heritage Foundation. It's available in the internet for free. Anyone can look at it. There are about 400 pages. And every country on the country is rated on how economically free it is, which economic freedoms it has, which are the most free capitalist countries. They're all countries where there are no economic problems under which most people suffer. Singapore, or Switzerland, or New Zealand, for example, or Australia, or Hong Kong. But what about the end of it? Who's at the end of the list? There are African countries, Democratic Congo, North Korea, we've already talked about that, or Cuba. You should take a look at that list and have a look, where are the people better off, in the capitalist countries or in the other countries? And just have a look at that list, and you will see that that is the rule rather than the exception, that the people are better off under capitalism. And why? Intellectuals are always fascinated by socialism and not from capitalism. It's a paradox. A system which in the 20th century helped 100 million, which resulted in 100 million deaths, socialism. So even in human terms, it has failed, whereas socialism, 35 it has helped in the last 35 years. More people have been helped out of poverty than ever before in history. So why is that the case? The intellectuals, I think they don't think. I think they don't understand capitalism. I think that's what it is. And maybe they want to have people involved in the system. They don't want it just being spontaneous.
So it's not something that some intellectual comes up with, and then this is being put into practice by the state. Of course, the intellectual wants to be needed. He wants to have his theory put into practice. And such as Lenin described it. But some intellectuals do not understand what an entrepreneurship actually is. I read an article in the Neue Zürcher. I wrote it, and it says that we decide as an entrepreneur in an intuitive fashion. It's not something irrational, mythical, but it's implicit knowledge. It's the many moments of learning. Look at Rossmann, for example. The drugstore chain in Germany. He says it's all a gut feeling for him, and many people don't understand the concept of gut feeling. Many intellectuals think, those who have read most of the books, they should earn more money than others. And that's not the way it works. And they think it's unfair that the capitalist, who may not even have gone to university, actually has a better car, a nicer house, and a more beautiful woman. And then the intellectual says there is something wrong with capitalism. This is not fair. The market order is wrong. We have to regulate. We have to interfere. We have to stop it somehow, or at least we have to distribute it differently. But that, of course, didn't lead us to anything good in the past. I gave you a number of practical examples, and that is about my approach. There is no theory in my book. I only compare really existing systems, like I did North Korea, South Korea, West Germany, East Germany, China before and after. Anti-capitalists have a different method. They compare a theory, some utopia, something that somebody came up with. They compare that with reality, and that's not fair. Because just imagine, you come home tonight to your wife, and she says to you, "Sweetheart, we have to talk. We have to talk. This is about divorce," and you're completely taken aback. What? Divorce? Everything is fine. We're doing better than all of our friends. Yes. But she started reading these novels, and in the novels, where they always kiss over breakfast and they're so romantic, and then she compared her marriage to this fairy tale story, and then she says, "Well, I know that the real life should be different. I want to have a prince as a husband." And then you say, "Hey, that's not fair. You can't compare me to a prince. Compare me to another guy around, the one who lives down the block." And if somebody says, "Hey, look, I came up with this perfect theory how society could work," I said, "Stop. Don't even talk anymore. Give me a concrete example where it has actually worked, and then I talk to you." And there is no such example. There is no such thing as a perfect society. But I say capitalism isn't the problem, but it is the solution. Thank you very much for your attention. Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, we are applauding, just the two of us now, since we don't have any larger audience. Please join us here for the discussion round. Well, first of all, wow, fantastic. This is all new for us. I do work in TV studios, but to have an event like this with participants, and then all of a sudden you have a camera here, and it was incredible that we also have the feedback from our viewers. And we get feedback through our chat functions, and that's so much fun because it tells me you're all part of this, you are following us. So we get questions, again, to the presentations. Now, the presentations, you will get them afterwards, yes. And then a remark, there was a gentleman who says, this is fun watching you people. Are we going to tape this? Yes, this is being taped. There is an English version and a German version, and you can actually then see it on YouTube. So if you have watched it now live, you can actually then afterwards watch it on YouTube. And let's see how many clicks we get. And now we have a number of great comments. And one thing that has also gone through my mind, just like Mr. Nottenkemper, I like your T-shirt. How often do you wear that, and how many do you have of those? I have another one called I Love Capitalism, just like the one, I Love New York. But I had it on so many times that I figured I'd do something different. I say, enjoy capitalism. It's a bit like the Coca-Cola commercial, isn't it? Is there any place where you can buy that? I want to have that T-shirt. Somebody said, I ordered it already. Great event. Too bad I'm not involved in that company. Somebody told me the other one, I Love Capitalism, that was my own idea. If we have somebody who says he wants to manufacture it, why not? I can maybe sign it and you have an autograph on it. How about that? But if you actually walk through the pedestrian precinct in Berlin, no, I wouldn't walk around in a T-shirt like that. I'm well built, but I think people may want to pick a fight with me, especially in the leftist part of town. But in my fitness club, I can do it. Now, you see how much consensus we have in society. Most people in Berlin who sees you on the street because of the T-shirt, he's at the same time as the guy who goes into a bakery and buys this capitalist bread from the capitalist baker. There is a contradiction, yes, and there is a lot of misunderstanding about how capitalism works. So you need to talk about it so people understand it. Yeah, well, capitalism is a word, people associate bad things with it. I had a discussion with another TV station, and there they said capitalism is the devil. It is also responsible for Corona. Everything bad about this world happens because of capitalism. And with some people, it's like that. When things go wrong and they haven't really brought about anything in their lives, they figure, oh, it's because of capitalism. Okay, that's an easy way out. You said that Bill Gates is supposed to be responsible for COVID-19 too. Exactly. I mean, there is a whole bunch of conspiracy theories. People say that he wants to kill all the children in Africa. So we will have a new and improved version 2 of COVID-19 by Bill Gates. That's what they say. Yeah, well, as a historian, I tell you, whenever there is crisis, people always look for a scapegoat, and it's usually a minority. When you had the cholera epidemics, then they started burning witches because they thought it was the witches. Or they said it was the Jews. The Jews, they had poisoned the wells. And now, in the financial crisis, it was, the greedy banker. Of course, there are greedy banker. When a plane crashes because of gravity, you don't want to blame gravity. Okay, Corona crisis. So they picked a guy like Bill Gates, which of course is so unfair because he does so much to help people and to fight poverty and diseases in the world. But it's like that. Rich people are often taken, as scapegoats for things that people simply don't understand. Well, these letters from the Bill Gates Foundations are really interesting reading. I mean, he is a billionaire. He has so much money. He doesn't need the money. And he wonders, how can he get the best profit out of it, instead of in terms of what, you know, how can society benefit from it? And he says, if child mortality goes down, then this is perfect. I mean, he has a capitalist approach even to helping, and this is great. So even in welfare thinking, you can use capitalist algorithms. Now, I have another question to what we're talking about just this very second. We had this with you earlier, this inequality of wealth. So you have the haves and you have the have-nots, the rich and the poor. When you talk to friends and they say, you know, when you have a cake, you know, there are 12 pieces, and if people take 2 or 3 pieces, and others have fewer pieces, that's the way it is. Can we still keep growing? Well, there's those people who think there is one piece of cake, and that if somebody is rich, he must have taken 2 pieces. Well, it's not always like that. So in China, the number of poor went from 88% to 1%. But at the same time, you had more and more rich people in China than ever before. It's the second largest country with billionaires in the world, next only to the US. There is a poem, actually, that tells you about this zero-sum game by Bertolt Brecht. I hope I get it together now. Poor man, rich man, they were looking at each other, and the poor man says, "If I weren't poor, you wouldn't be rich." That is the stupidest poem I have ever heard. That's why I learned it by heart, because it tells you this is this zero-sum game that people believe in. But of course, it doesn't make any sense. In the past 35 years, the number of billionaires have gone up. At the same time, there are fewer poor people. So you see, it isn't like that. People believe in this zero sum, and the zero sum does not exist. So the question is envy. I'm interested in the fate of poor people. That is important. I go to China a lot. If I ask, you know, would you like to go back to Mao Zedong, they would laugh at you in China. Now, in absolute terms, poverty has gone down, but poverty is, of course, always seen in relative terms. That's true. Relative poverty, that's something that, don't get me started on that. I tell you, relative poverty means if you are, you know, have whatever, 5–10% less than the average, then you're relatively poor. So let's say we use a magic wand, and now everybody gets 10 times more than what we now have. You have 10% more, 10 times more, you have 10 times more, I have 10 times more. So how would that have changed the poverty? Nothing, because the poor people would still have less than the rich people, and they would still consider themselves to be poor. But that assumes that the pie is getting better. But can it get better? Wait, I'll give you another example. If you are a very good lawyer and you can work on your computer and have a good secretary, and she is maybe even better on the PC, the secretary is better than him because she can write faster, and he, of course, is better because he has studied law. And for him, it's worth his while to give his text to his secretary so she writes it. So, you know, this is exchanging your talents. And this only works if both sides somehow benefit from it. And it's not always that, you know, one part takes it away, the other one does it voluntarily. No. So basically, you want wealth on either side. Well, the limitations of growth, that was your question. There are those prophets who says this is the end of growth, it cannot go on. And it's always been contradicted by historic facts. But the resources are limited. How can we still keep growing? That is my question. Okay, let's take a modern iPhone. It takes very few resources compared to all the machines that are actually part of an iPhone. There are actually 40 different types of devices that are included in an iPhone. The camera, the calculator, the telephone, everything is in there. So it's basically 10, 20 things that you have in there, a TV set, everything in one iPhone. And it was not some socialist thinker, but it was a capitalist, a pure capitalist, Steve Jobs. So you can only imagine growth in your world at the moment. And of course, you have to go beyond those limits to grow. And then growth is possible, and growth will always go on. Okay, now we're talking about the PIB. And if Google tells me I take this road and I actually save 10 minutes, this is an important saving for me. And it doesn't really, help the economy as such, but it is something that helps me. So it's not everything is measurable in straight numbers in terms of growth. Now, as to wealth. So 40% of wealth in the world is owned by 3%, and 10% still hold more than half. Well, let's talk about these numbers. Most of these figures, there are some that are even more extreme. They're based on the Oxfam study. A bunch of rich people getting together, and then they do the Oxfam study. And that study is a fake study. Everybody who is actually seriously involved in this field knows that these numbers are completely wrong. Why? Well, according to Oxfam, there would be more poor people in Germany than in the poorest country of Africa. Since you get money from the state to go to university, you are now in debt with a university loan, and that means that you're actually poorer than somebody in Ethiopia who doesn't have any debt. I mean, that shows you how ridiculous this way of calculating is. So we're basically talking about envy here, envy and people who simply don't want others to be rich. Do we have to have super rich people? Well, that's the same question as, do we have to have successful people and successful entrepreneurs? Let's take a look at some of the richest people in the world. Jeff Bezos. Why is he so rich? Well, he came up with Amazon. Bill Gates, Microsoft. And then you have a guy like Larry Page, the guys, the Google brothers, and Michael Bloomberg. Now, in Germany, it was the Albrecht brothers from Aldi. They had this great idea of a discount supermarket. That made it possible for many people to buy good quality food at a decent price. And now it's Lidl. Schwarz is one of the richest people in Germany. And the question is, why did they get so rich? Well, they got rich because they wanted to satisfy the needs of as many people as possible. And let's assume he's got 41 billions on his savings account or under his pillow. I don't know where he keeps his money. And it's not like that. He's got his money in the companies that are creating wealth. So if my question is, should there be super rich people? Well, then you should also ask, should there be entrepreneurs? And I say yes, yes, and yes.
And we're talking about the environmental satisfaction is not being reflected in at the moment. I was in the GDR at the time, and when I went to the GDR, the air smelt of lignite coal burning, and every 3 hours, the power was turned off. There were brownouts, and when I think today we have got clean air. And the weekends, if you spend your weekends cycling down rivers, and the environmental quality, the air quality has improved a great deal. That's not measured. Steven Pinker, he has prepared lots of statistics and books, and he has said in the last 10 years, many water quality, air quality have improved massively. But those are things which aren't talked about much in the media, and because that's good news, and media don't write good news. I don't want to criticize media, but as a journalist, we want to have learned maybe if the dog bites the postman, that's not news. But if the postman bites the dog, that's news. So there's unusual and the usual. There's the norm and out of the norm. The papers can't always write 58 aircraft landed safely today. That's boring. But if a plane crashes, that's news. It happens rarely, but that's news. And it can create the wrong impression for people looking at the media. That might not be the total reality. The environment has improved in many ways. The climate change is definitely a problem, and Stephen Pinkett says, for example, he says nuclear power stations should be built now. They're very safe nowadays. They help the environment, and that route has now been stopped in Germany because of overreaching green considerations. If we're talking about emission trading, we'll be talking about that later. The emissions and pollution regulates itself. The dirty power stations are turned off all by themselves because of the trading that's going on. We talked about the concentration of wealth. Capitalism does have a destructive aspect. That has been mentioned before. Amazon won't exist in a few years, says Bezos, because he thinks something will come along and replace Amazon. The current rich will be replaced by the next rich generation. And there is a generation and destruction and regeneration. So there is the great dynamic system here. Scientists have calculated the richest American families, they've calculated it takes about 8 to 13 years for their wealth to halve after the first generation has passed on. A number of questions have been asked. Why does capitalism work now better in China, better than in various Western countries, despite the 5-year plans and the socialism? What about the theory that China is currently has the best form of government? What about China and Corona? I don't know if you watched the news yesterday. The system, this total monitoring, total observation of the state, apparently is better for Corona than other states. What do you think about that? Well, lots of different questions there. Politically speaking, China's a dictatorship, and you can't express your opinion there, and there is great control, excessive control. But economically speaking, it's different, and they are currently very successful because over the last decades, they have had a good relationship, good mix between state and market, because it's switched towards more market. That's my test tube theory. The absolute relationship between state and market is not important but you have to understand the development. If you understand how things develop, the relative nature, the relativeness between state and market change. In Venezuela, too much state, less market, and things changed. In China, there's more and more market and less state, and as soon as it changes, that relationship, then the development will change. And in terms of Corona, there are interesting statistics from the Deep Knowledge Institute in London, and they checked which countries have done best with handled Corona best, and I compared that list with the list of the economic the countries with the most economic freedoms, and there is a good overlap there. Countries like Singapore and South Korea and Australia, which are very free in terms of capitalism, they have done very well in terms of Corona. And in China, there's a dictatorial system, and currently it looks like they've dealt with it very well. And whether or not that, but it has affected people's freedoms. And I don't think we can take that as a positive example for us. If you compare that with Taiwan, they did even better. And that Taiwan is definitely a free country. But if you look at the pictures now from the US, for example, and the corona deaths and the people with the illness and the curfews, countries which are governed by machos, they don't do so bad. We got Trump in America, we got Johnson in England, we got Bolsonaro in Brazil, and any country that is being governed by those kind of dictatorial people who wish to show how strong they are, those countries have a problem. It's not a state failure so much as the original point of having a state is to deal with crises, is to help the population. Nowadays one talks about everything under the sun. In the US, when I was there were elections taking place. Our discussion, all they talked about was transgender toilets, and to have enough toilets for transgender. And in the end, there were enough transgender toilets, but there weren't enough face masks. So sometimes the discussion goes wrong. The state missed its the reason for it being there, which is to help and protect the population. And so wherever the core is missing, things don't look. If you look at Germany, the defense, the military in Germany is desolate. And if you look at the state, instead of looking at how to deal with and cope with a pandemic, they were thinking about ways of redistributing the money collected by taxation. The state is too strong where it should be weak, and is too weak where it should be strong. Two other aspects. Why do we know so little about capitalism? I know one studied, I've understood it. So there's a question here: why isn't capitalism part of school education? We had capitalism is not part of what one learns in the education system. And what about this feeling of that capitalism isn't right, and the force of capitalism? I think it has to do with ideology. That if you look at what happens in schools, universities, dominant there are anti-capitalist ideologies, left-moving technologies. They talk about capitalism, but only negative aspects are raised and not the positive aspects, that people have certain views, have certain ideologies, and they hold lectures which emphasize those aspects. And when I speak with young people, they might have studied economics, but they've never heard about the positive aspects of capitalism. For example, they haven't heard about Mao or the Great Leap Forward, or they haven't learned about it. It's not part of their history lesson today. But then again, that's why I'm here. I write those books. Another question here: the great challenges, digitalization and climate change, will they result in a redistribution of wealth rather than social economics? And capitalism, you say it's a solution. Where are the limits of the system? And in the future, in the digital future, how will it have to adjust? Mr. Beckham was a fund manager, and he had, during the 90s, he introduced shares for properties, And his question, I seem to remember, was how that the Corona will intend to emphasize and exacerbate these developments and will weaken the redistribution. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the planned economic aspect will result in this weakness. In Germany, I don't think the effects of Corona are the problem. I think we're looking at the energy industry has been changed into a planned industry, and it's never worked, and it won't work now. The electricity costs in Germany are massively high as a catastrophe, and the energy change in Germany is costing a huge amounts of money, massive amounts of money, and hasn't worked, and has turned the industry into a planned industry, into a state-run industry. Look at Berlin with the cap on rent, and I've already proven that system can't work. And now the thing I worry about most is the car industry. Because the car industry is the core of German industry, and what we're seeing there is that first of all they tried to say people got 6,000 euros to buy an electric car, and Mrs. Merkel said in 2020 you have to have 1 million electric cars on German roads, and as we know that hasn't happened. And so then they said, okay, if they don't do it that way, we'll try and give other incentives, but the people don't do what the state tells them to do, so we'll have to have another tack, and we'll have these fleet targets, and we'll force the companies to build the cars which we want them to do. So the consumer isn't deciding which car he wants, but some state department, some politician is deciding what consumers should buy. So they think they are better than the consumers. And this whole development, moving towards planned economies, planned industries. Trump is also a very negative force. Globalization helped a great deal, but it's now being forced back towards isolationism, protectionism, and I think that is the threat. That is the problem. These are all reactions on crises, surely. What these responses are responses to crises. I checked your book out last night, and in the end, what you're saying is crises are part of the economy, and just like illnesses are part of living, and the immune forces are there and have to be encouraged. So companies who are situated aren't properly positioned will suffer, but that's part of it. But that's part of improving one's immune system. So everything we do to save jobs, suddenly we want to use 130 billion euros to protect our economy. The state banks are pumping money into the system, and you're saying that is completely wrong. It's going to take us straight into the next crisis. Let me say, the Corona crisis is an exception, maybe. The state is now practically saying that companies they cannot produce, they can't close down, and so the state, because it has been, they do have to respond. But the overall problem of the crisis is that businesses are being saved just to save jobs. That has never worked. But what about Lufthansa? That Lufthansa is being, so we can't do without Lufthansa. We discussed it yesterday in our team. So there's Ryanair. It doesn't want state funds. It's got its people might not like flying with Ryanair, but they've got lots of money in the bank. And Alitalia or Lufthansa or Air France, they are protecting their industries. And Ryanair is saying we want fair access to the markets. And I think that is cementing the system as it is. Let me say that the first companies which raised their hands and said we should register bankruptcy because of Corona, companies in that situation, they've been suffering for many years. They've been having economic problems for many years, and now suddenly Corona comes along, and suddenly people like Italia, they can't survive, and now they have to be saved. But they had problems before, and so I don't think it's a good idea to save companies which were doing badly before and weren't successfully before the crisis. We're talking about these massive indebtedness that there are many investors are worried about that. The solution for these mountains of debt is not necessarily growth. The solution is inflation, would be to reform state banks, or your recipe would have radical capitalistic reforms. So what do you mean by that exactly in concrete terms? What are radical capitalist reforms? Well, examples, as I've mentioned, Ronald Reagan, he said in the US a few years back, or Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, or in Sweden in the 80s and 90s, which was to deregulate the state, let the market forces take over. Many people are skeptical about that. Things are going to get a lot worse. But at some time, the current moves will produce the right results. In the history, this has happened before, and examples of where it worked. And look at the world crisis of 1929. The wrong things happened, and the Great Depression was triggered by that, and everything got worse and worse and worse by what the state did. It's not some Hollywood film we're in. It's not a happy end necessarily, where everything's bad, gets bad, and then everything turns out great. But that's not how history works. And one can also, things can work out badly. So I think one has to do what is necessary, and that we can look in the history and see what's done well in the past, but whether or not it's going to work again, we don't know. We need to persuade people of what is done, but there are no guarantees in this world. Let me state that as well. There was an article in the FAZ recently, is to get rid of the junk in Germany. There are so many laws, so many rules and regulations and institutions which we simply don't need, but they're there and they're staying. So I want you just to go through the whole list and catalogue and delete that which is superfluous, and that's going to take a lot of actions. We need a state that has its limits, and lots of the costs and the benefits can't be seen at the moment. We need a state which currently the ball is out of court. We need to get the ball back into court, and we need to have clever, smart regulations. And look at the building industry, for example. I know a lot about the building industry. There are about 25,000 laws and rules in Germany. It's crazy how many regulations there are, and it's driven up the price of building, the cost of building, and there are thousands of rules, and hardly anyone in Germany can afford to buy a house, because that's the fault of capitalism and its rules. Yeah, but the zero interest rates means that more and more money isn't currently being pumped in the property market, and that has pushed up prices. And also, the situation is also difficult for many tenants in the major cities of Germany, and all of these rules and regulations, limits and restrictions, they pushed up the price of building as well, and less was built. On the other hand, there is money is being pumped into the property industry, but that's onto the owner side, not on the tenant side.